Back in college, I used to drive up the Oregon coast on weekends, then just sleep in my car when I got tired. I woke from a nap in the driver's seat, and something just didn't feel quite right. It was just dusk, and the light was fading pretty fast. I yawned and stretched, and as I did so, I turned my head to the side and just caught a face ducking down below my rear passenger window. I went to hit the lock button just to make sure, and in my panic, I accidentally unlocked the doors briefly and then locked them again. I stared at the window for a few minutes, knowing that someone was crouching just out of sight. Eventually, I started the car and thought I heard a scuffing sound. Whoever it was didn't reappear, but that was enough for me. As I noped out of there and pulled out back onto Highway 101, I glanced back, and a bald figure in a red t-shirt with something wrapped around his face booked it into the woods on the side of the road. That was the end of that weekend trip. I drove the 2 hours back to my dorm room, white-knuckled hands locked on the steering wheel. I had to pull over a few miles down the road, though, to deal with the adrenaline shakes. I'm a criminal defense investigator. I had a murder case involving two brothers. The one accused of the murders was very autistic, and his brother was a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic brother lived in a potato shack in the middle of the desert. I needed to talk to him several times throughout the course of the investigation, and since he didn't have a phone or electricity, I had to drive several hours out to his house and yell his name from the fence line until he came out of the shack. This investigation lasted for several years, and over time, I developed a rapport with the schizophrenic brother. I kind of got to like him. He would talk your ear off about the aliens with golden eyes and the underground tunnels that connect all the Walmarts in the country, but he was pretty entertaining. Part of me wonders how much of it was a show. Schizophrenic brother eventually gets a girlfriend. She's a tweaker who has mistaken his schizophrenia for meth-induced psychosis. I talked to her a few times in jail when she was sober, and she was surprisingly charming and insightful. The last time I go to see schizophrenic brother, it's a dark winter night, and tweaker girlfriend is there. She's lurking in the shadows and staring daggers at me the entire time I'm talking to him. I cut off his conversation about the speakers and his fillings and walk back to my truck to leave. A minute later, schizophrenic brother comes running out and tells me that he wants to show me something in his shack. He's never invited me inside before, and I'm not thrilled by the prospect. The whole thing feels off to me, so I tell him I have to get going and start the truck. The look of relief on his face when I declined to go inside convinced me that tweaker girlfriend was waiting behind the door with a hammer or something. A few months later, I learned that she shot him in his sleep and stashed his body in an old refrigerator. She has since pleaded guilty to his murder. I was house-sitting for my dad while he was away for work. The house is in the middle of nowhere and barely even on Google Maps. Usually, when friends would come over, I would have to drive to the top of the nearest paved road and lead them down a few more paved streets to my dad's place. I had had a few drinks with friends and been dropped off by a friend that lived close by. He dropped me at the side of the house because it was easier for him to turn around from there. I walked up the stairs and entered with my key through the side door that led to the kitchen. The kitchen overlooked the front garden, but the front door was nestled into a small porch and wasn't visible to me. I saw a movement in the front garden while making tea and immediately turned off the lights. There was a man trying to look into the kitchen windows from the garden. He ended up walking around to the wall to ceiling glass doors around the back of the house, cupping his hands to the glass and trying to look in. I wasn't completely sober that night, so I remember just thinking the situation didn't seem real. He couldn't see me in the dark, but I was hiding behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining lounge area open floor plan. I had stupidly not locked one of the glass doors closer to the front door, and he started entering the house in the pitch black, not realizing I was maybe 10 feet away from him. I had already called the friend who had dropped me off, but as I knew he was still nearby, cops would have taken at least 30 minutes to get to me, knowing his parents kept a gun in a safe in the truck. I remember just wanting to run. But if I ran, I'd be alone in the middle of nowhere with a deranged man chasing after me. As the guy walked further into the house, I stepped out and pulled a knife on him again. I was not sober. It was a very stupid thing to do. He tried to incoherently make conversation, but I got him out of the door just as my friend pulled up with his gun. The dude bolted to his car that was parked in an area concealed by trees. Turns out he was the gardener. He had been keeping tabs on me, knew I was house-sitting alone for my dad while he was out of town, was very high on meth, he admitted to me while I had the knife out, and had been waiting for me to come home. Except I had used the side door that night, something I never usually did. If I hadn't have used the side door that night, I have no idea what would have happened. I also have no idea what would have happened if my friend hadn't come back when I called him, because the guy was starting to get aggressive and trying to come towards me right when my friend got there with his gun out. Like to joke about it now, but it was the worst scenario I have ever experienced, where I wanted to just run and get the FCK away. I was in Lumbini, Nepal. It's a small town built around this complex of ruins that was once the palatial home of Siddhartha Gautama. The Bodhi tree is located there. I was staying in a cheap hotel along a muddy road leading out of the city and was the only guest in the building. Many stray dogs roamed the streets of that quarter at night, and you'd often hear them barking or getting into fights. This one night was particularly bad. A low fog had settled on the road, and the dogs were out in force, howling and barking. Out of nowhere came this bellowing roar, one so loud and sonorous I felt it in my chest. Then a vacuum of complete silence. All I could think of were ways to keep whatever had made that sound outside. The next day, I heard that a tiger had wandered over from the nearby reserve along the lake and eaten a few of those stray dogs. I worked a lot in remote areas of West Texas servicing oil field-related equipment. One time, I was out in the middle of nowhere, as usual, and to the northeast was a isolated hill that's bigger than a regular hill but smaller than a mountain. Everywhere else around was pretty flat. There was one road in and out of the site where I was at some point. When I was working on a control box, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the horizon, looked all around the butte, and went back to work. This happened a few more times within several minutes, until I finally saw something move on the side of one of the rock outcroppings on the butte. I went to my truck, grabbed my binoculars, and the figure hid behind that outcropping. It was definitely a human. I glassed him for a good 20 minutes, and I could see him peek around every couple of minutes. Eventually, he leaned out so far that I could see the silhouette of the barrel of a rifle slung around his back. At some point, he was hidden behind his rock for a while, and the next time he peeked out, I couldn't see the rifle. He had either put it down somewhere, or he was now holding it. I immediately felt a sense of impending doom. The hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. I very quickly collected my tools, got my AR-15 from behind the driver's seat and sat it on the passenger seat and tore out of there. I sped down the dirt road, almost clipped the cattle guard, and started cruising down the highway just as the adrenaline started to wear off. I remember the metal taste in my mouth and having to grip the steering wheel to keep my fingers from twitching. A few miles down the road, a maroon Suburban full of guys was pulled over on the oncoming side of the road. They definitely weren't oil field workers, shades all around, buzzed heads, all intently looking at me. I expected them to pull a U-turn and pursue me, but they didn't. I can't prove that this is what was happening, but I do know that cartel guys run operations where one scouts for guys working alone and calls in a group of guys to rob them of their truck and tools.